This was day 508 of the Trump administration, and these are the images, the historic photo op being broadcast around the world tonight. We just don't know yet what this all means. It's currently just after 11 a.m. in Singapore, where Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un are still meeting. This marks the first ever meeting between a sitting president of the U.S. and a North Korean leader. Immediately after their initial handshake, President Trump, Kim Jong-un, spoke with reporters.
I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. We'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
Well, it was not easy to get here.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 국민과 발행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리고 있었는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The past worked as fetters on our wings, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them, and we are here today.
It's a remarkable event in many ways. Take two from that photo op right there, how remarkable it is for him to leave his country and how remarkable it is for us to hear his voice. The president and Kim Jong-un spent their one-on-one time along with only translators, notably no note takers in the room. Then they took the conversation down a long hallway, another meeting with the rest of their staff. That's still going on. In about a half hour, we are expecting the president, Kim Jong-un, to take part in a working lunch. We want to bring in our leadoff panel on a Monday night. Nicole Wallace, veteran of the Bush White House, host of Deadline White House, 4 p.m. Eastern Time right here on this network. Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA and the Pentagon. Gordon Chang, columnist for the Daily Beast, author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, if we think that's germane. Just kidding. And we begin with NBC News correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Yeah, exactly. Kelly is where it's all happening in Singapore. Kelly, do we have it about right that we believe this kind of bilateral conversation with staff is still going on?
That's our understanding now, and this is a multi-event day, in part, Brian, because both of these leaders are very aware of branding, of spectacle. To some extent, you could argue for North Korea propaganda, and so there was a need here to not simply meet behind closed doors and emerge at the end of a day, but to have intervals where we are seeing the leaders, the public can judge how they are interacting. You've talked about the body language and the words that have been said, but also to give sort of data points through the day visually, which are important for both countries and really for the record of history. And for President Trump, he has said plainly a number of times that although there are working groups that have met and have really gone into the nitty-gritty of what could be on the table between these two countries, he has said again and again, it is not about staff, it's not about experts, it's about relationship. And so we saw at the beginning of this, from handshake to time alone, as you've been describing tonight, how it's the interpreters, but just these leaders getting a sense of each other. The president has leaned heavily when he's talked to reporters about the fact that he felt he could have a gut check moment with Kim Jong-un. He would be able to tell, and that relationship would be the thing he would leverage for any outcome for the United States. Now, there are certainly diplomatic histories here that have shown deception on the part of North Korea. A lot of that is a turn of the page for this president, who likes to believe through the force of his own personality, and in many ways both men are cults of personality in their own right, that is the tool he brings to this. The president would also say that there was almost a brinksmanship of potential hot war only months ago, and now they're at a point where there aren't rockets and missiles being tested. The rhetoric between the two men that was deranged maniac and little rocket man, that is all melted away. And today it's the superlatives we've come to know from President Trump about an excellent relationship and optimism. Certainly Secretary of State Pompeo, who has been in the nitty-gritty of this as well and has met Kim Jong-un before, says the president is trying to project this confidence, but he is often the one who repeatedly says complete, irreversible, verifiable nuclear disarmament on the part of North Korea. President Trump doesn't use that phrase as much. He is much more focused on what the relationship can mean and how he will project this as a demonstration of what he could do that past presidents have not. For better or worse, history will decide, but this is a memorable moment that will be in the biographies of both of these men for a long time to come. Brian?
With midday approaching in Singapore and midnight approaching here on the east coast of the U.S., our thanks to Kelly O'Donnell for getting our broadcast situated with a situation report from there. Okay, Nicole Wallace. So Kelly appropriately kind of paraphrased the president. The staff meetings are over. This is down to me and him. This is where I excel. And the problem is there are going to be deliverables that are expected out of this thing.
Right. So the two things I've heard all night from former national security officials from past Democratic and Republican administrations are around two central concerns. One, that first meeting took place without anyone in the room. So whatever kicked off this first ever interaction between the two leaders, America and North Korea, has no witnesses. And Keir Simmons of NBC News reported today at 4 o'clock that both men are known liars. So it's not a good starting point for a meeting with so many potential consequences. The second was at the end of Kelly's report there, where the stated goal, U.S. policy, is what was articulated by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And Kelly mentioned it, certifiable, verifiable denuclearization. Donald Trump didn't match that goal. His goal was, I'm going to decide in the first minute if I like him or not. So we now have U.S. policy set at something highly unlikely to be achieved today, if ever, and a president who made this all about himself. Go figure.
Jeremy Bash, our friend Steve Schmidt talks about the absence of rigor. It's a word he loves, and so do I. Was it an absence of rigor that led our president, our side, to say, sure, just you and me and the translators in the room, nobody needs to know for posterity's sake?
Well, it was certainly a mistake to wing it. It was a mistake not to prepare. I think there could be room for two leaders to get together to have some private conversations. But I think that conversation was really kind of basically bromides and sort of niceties. You know, you and I are going to work together. I think we're now down to brass tacks with, on the U.S. side, the Secretary of State, the Chief of Staff, and the National Security Advisor. But let's not forget, Brian, the big picture here, which is the United States is the most important bastion of freedom in the world. North Korea is the most important bastion of repression. It is a prison state. It is a police state. And we have elevated that police state. We have elevated that dictator by putting him on the same stage as the American president. Now, it may be worth it if we can help guarantee the security of our allies and our own country. But I think that's not clear. I think tonight was a lot about symbolism. Whether it's actually significant remains to be seen.
Gordon, what makes you think that Kim Jong-un is going to say, OK, we'll denuclearize?
We can get to that point, Brian, if the United States is willing to apply real maximum pressure.
It's a long ball game.
It's a long ball game. The administration believes that U.S. and UN sanctions have reduced the flow of international payments to North Korea by about 50%. Wall Street Journal reported that. But we have a long way to go. We need to get that down to about 10%. And we can do that by a number of stricter sanctions on North Korea, but more important, going after North Korea's major power backers, Russia and China. Chinese banks have been laundering money for North Korea, and it's not just the small ones. All four of the so-called Big Four banks have been handling North Korea's cash. That's a violation of U.S. federal law. That gives us enormous leverage.
Because this has been most of your adult life's work, did I get it about right? The two shocking things about seeing this scene of the two guys is Kim Jong-un is out of his country, and listen to his voice.
Yes. Well, Kim Jong-un is much more outgoing than his father. His father spoke only once in public, and then he said about 13, 14 words, something like, long live the Korean People's Army. Now, Kim Jong-un has actually spoken to the North Korean people, but we generally don't hear that. The more important thing that you point out, and I think it's absolutely critical, is that Kim Jong-un felt secure enough to leave North Korea for 3 or 4 days. Now, he wants to get back quickly, which is an indication. There are problems in the military. We know that because of that recent reshuffle of the top 3 posts at the Korean People's Army. That is an indication that Kim is a little bit nervous. And there's all sorts of other indications that all is not well in North Korea at this particular moment.
I also felt the need tonight to point out that they don't make a car that he can use as a limousine overseas. They don't make a jet airliner that they can fly to Singapore. He's driving a German armored limousine and in a Air China commercial jetliner.
Both of those are significant. With regard to the Air China, that is China's flag carrier. Basically, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is saying to President Trump, look, Kim Jong-un is my vassal. You better not hurt him. With regard to that Mercedes, Kim Jong-un engages in gift politics like his father and grandfather. That's the giving of luxury items to senior regime elements to buy their loyalty. 2 things are given, really important. Rolex watches and Mercedes. North Korea buys Mercedes in
if we
hundreds.
leave now.
So that is significant that he actually arrived in that particular brand of German car.
And Courvoisier, apparently.
Oh, really?
Yes, he has a particular penchant for a certain kind of alcohol. But what else have they built in North Korea, or what have they built? 60 nuclear weapons, Brian.
Yeah.
Intercontinental ballistic missiles, medium and short-range missiles, 100,000 rockets aimed at Seoul, a chemical weapons program that was used literally for fratricide to kill his own brother, a biological weapons program. So I think the real important yardstick of tonight and the diplomacy that will unfold, and the press conference we'll probably hear at about 4 a.m. Eastern, is will the North Koreans give up these weapons that will threaten the United States and our allies? If not, then this was a nice photo op, but it really doesn't mean anything for our own security.
Back up one thing to the 100,000 artillery tubes pointing at Seoul. This is where I always go back to. Take nukes off the table. Let's just say it's fantasy land and they're going to go home and destroy them all by the weekend. You have 100,000 artillery tubes aimed at a city of 25 million people, if you include its environs. That's a first strike capability right there.
And Seoul is an amazing city. If you've ever been there, you take off from a helicopter at Yangsang Military Garrison in downtown Seoul, where the American military is there with the Republic of Korea, the South Korean military. And if you fly north to the DMZ, you see the entire city. And it is amazing what the South Korean people have achieved over the last generation and a half. Really at war, basically on the border with a hostile regime. There's never been peace there, as we've been discussing all night. And they've created an amazing, immaculate city. And that city lives under daily threat from these artillery tubes from the north.
Nicole, let's talk about politics. How does this, what happens now in the next 12 to 24 hours?
Well, 2 things. It's important to note that Donald Trump has been talking about this summit with his friends and his outside advisors as a big moment for him in the sun. It was never going to be canceled. I went back and looked at communications from senior national security officials in this White House around the 25th and 26th when there were news reports that it was on ice, and there were meetings during that time when they were putting out this sort of their own fake news that the summit was off. It was never off. Advanced planning was never canceled because he needs it. This is what he plans to run on in the midterms. The second point I make about what happened today, and I know we live in a 24-hour news cycle. We're fixated on the moment. We've been covering this minute by minute. This didn't happen in a vacuum. He left Canada, where he literally seemed to thrill in sticking his finger in the eyes of our oldest, closest, most reliable allies, to legitimize, and you can never put that toothpaste back in the tube. He has now elevated the leader of North Korea to a stature that he can never undo. So literally on the plane ride from Canada, where he seemed to delight in ridiculing and harsh personal attacks against some of our closest allies, he then landed and called it a tremendous honor to be there with this murderous dictator who Republicans used to describe as a thug before they all got brainwashed by Trumpism.
Gordon, he does get points for the spectacle of it all. This is a history-making event, and if it's going to make the world safer for our children and grandchildren,
Yes, I mean, we've eventually got to talk about human rights for a number of reasons. First of all, Otto Warmbier, this is the one-year anniversary that he came back and then he died shortly after that. There's a guy named David Snedden, an American, who was probably kidnapped by the North Koreans. We haven't gotten an accounting for him. There's the Japanese abductees. President Trump said publicly that he was going to get an accounting for Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister. And this is the most horrific regime on earth. But the one thing we got to remember, though, is that we give state visits to China, and China engages in horrific practices of its own. And so we need to sort of put this in perspective. I am sort of viscerally, I agree with you. I don't really like the idea of U.S. and Korean flags next to each other. But if that's a small price to pay, then I'm willing to do it, because one thing President Trump can do here, and this is important when you look at the scheme of things, if he can win over North Korea to be a friend, that is one more friend that we have in a struggle with a China that is attacking us across the board. Yeah. That is China's only military ally. That would be undercutting North Korea, China's narrative that they're going to take over the world. That's important for us. It's a small price to pay.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.